They say the quietest people have the biggest secrets, and in one small neighborhood, a Hollywood legend was living in the shadows, hidden in plain sight. Keanu Reeves, the beloved star of The Matrix and John Wick, wasn't just avoiding the spotlight. Some believed he was hiding something. And when the police showed up at his house one night, suspicions turned into accusations. But no one was prepared for the truth. Keanu Reeves is one of the most famous actors in the world. But unlike most celebrities, he doesn't live in a mansion with bodyguards and an entourage. No expensive parties, no paparazzi waiting there outside his gate. Instead, he lives a quiet, almost invisible life in an ordinary neighborhood. But to his neighbor Melanie, that was exactly the problem. He was too quiet, too private, and in her eyes, too suspicious. And one night, when the internet across the neighborhood mysteriously went down, Melanie called the police, certain she had just uncovered something sinister. What she didn't know, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. A quiet night, until it wasn't. It started out as an ordinary evening. One of those nights where the world felt still, where time seemed to slow down. The air outside was crisp, carrying the soft murmur of the city in the distance. A few streetlights flickered lazily, casting long, stretching shadows across empty sidewalks. The occasional car rolled by, its headlights sweeping briefly through windows before vanishing into the darkness. In his home, Keanu Reeves was tucked away in his quiet sanctuary, a cup of tea resting on the table beside him. He wasn't filming, wasn't promoting a movie, wasn't out in the Hollywood scene. He was doing something he had always loved, reading. A thick novel set open in his hands, his eyes tracing the lines of ink on paper. The words pulled him into another world, a temporary escape. Even though he wasn't running from anything, he enjoyed these moments, the stillness, the solitude, the feeling of being completely undisturbed. Outside, the neighborhood was as peaceful as ever. A small row of homes, each one with its own story, its own late-night routines. Some houses had lights flickering from TV screens. Others sat in darkness, their owners long asleep. The hum of crickets blended with the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But across the street, one pair of eyes wasn't at rest. Melanie's growing suspicion. Melanie sat curled up on her couch, scrolling through her phone. The blue light from the screen illuminated her face, reflecting in her tired eyes. She wasn't particularly looking for anything, just mindlessly jumping between apps, social media, the news, a few unread messages. And then she noticed it. The Wi-Fi was down. Her video stopped loading, the little buffering circle spinning endlessly. She furrowed her brows, tapping her phone screen as if that would make a difference. She sighed, sat up, and reached for the router tucked beside her TV stand. A simple reset should do the trick. She waited. 1 minute, 2, still nothing. Annoyed, she switched to her mobile data and checked the local neighborhood Facebook group. Dozens of posts flooded her feed. Anyone else's internet acting weird? Wi-Fi keeps cutting in and out. What's going on? Network down? Might be the provider. Melanie frowned. Damn, that was strange. An entire section of the neighborhood having the same issue at the same time? It wasn't unheard of, but still, something about it didn't sit right with her. She opened her Wi-Fi settings to check the available networks. Most of them had the same dreaded no connection warning beside their names, except one. One network was still up, still strong, still working perfectly. Keanu Reeves. Melanie's stomach did a small flip. That's weird. How was his internet the only one untouched? Maybe he had a different provider. Maybe he had some kind of expensive security system. Maybe her thoughts were cut short as she glanced up toward his house. And that's when she saw it, the shadow in the night. A flicker of movement, a dark figure crouched near Keanu's security camera. Her heart skipped a beat. The street light barely caught the silhouette, but she could see the outline of someone hunched low, moving carefully, deliberately. Their fingers moved quickly over what looked like a laptop. The faint glow of the screen reflected off their hands as they typed furiously, completely unaware that someone was watching. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. What the hell? Her first instinct was to look for Keanu, but there was no sign of him. No movement inside the house, no reaction to the figure outside. A cold chill ran down her spine. Was this a hacker, a break-in? Her mind raced. Or was this proof of something bigger? For months, something about Keanu Reeves had never sat right with her. He was too quiet, too private. He lived like a ghost, slipping in and out of his house without a word to anyone. No family visits, no loud music, no social gatherings. It was almost unnatural. And now, on the very night the neighborhood's internet mysteriously cut out, his house was untouched. Her gut told her this wasn't a coincidence. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her phone tighter. She had spent so much time wondering about Keanu. What if she was finally seeing the truth? What if this wasn't just a simple power outage? What if he was hiding something? Her pulse pounded as she made a decision. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The line connected almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? Melanie licked her lips, forcing her almost to stay steady. There's something strange going on at my neighbor's house, she said quickly. You need to send someone, now. Her eyes flicked back to the scene outside. The figure near Keanu's house moved again, faster this time. Then, without warning, they disappeared into the darkness. Gone. Melanie's breath hitched. The police had to hurry. She hung up the phone, her mind racing with possibilities, with certainty. She had done the right thing. She was sure of it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was how wrong she was. The night shatters, the distant wail of sirens ripped through the stillness, slicing the quiet night apart. A kaleidoscope of flashing red and blue lights swept across the suburban houses, bouncing off parked cars, illuminating the cracked pavement with an eerie, pulsing glow. The once peaceful neighborhood now looked like a crime scene. Inside his dimly lit home, Keanu Reeves lifted his gaze from the pages of his book, his brow creasing. He listened. The sirens were getting closer. Then, the reflection of rotating police lights flickered against his window. He set the book down carefully, standing up, moving toward the glass. His footsteps were soft against the hardwood floor, measured and calm. And then, he saw them. Police cars. Multiple. A cluster of uniformed officers moving with a sense of urgency, their radios crackling. Their presence was deliberate. This wasn't some routine patrol. Keanu exhaled slowly. He had encountered law enforcement before, on film sets, at events, in real life, but never like this. Not here, not outside his home. Then, a sharp, rapid knock at the door. Bang! 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 The sound echoed through the walls. Keanu closed his eyes for a second, centering himself, then walked forward. His movements were unhurried, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He reached for the doorknob and pulled it open. Instantly, his vision was flooded with bright beams of light as multiple flashlights snapped onto him, cutting into the darkness. He didn't flinch. Beyond the glare, he saw their faces, stern, professional, watching him carefully, waiting for a reaction. One of the officers standing closest straightened his stance. Sir, step outside. Keanu blinked, his deep brown eyes studying them for a moment. Not with fear, not with anger, just quiet curiosity. Then he complied. With a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped onto the porch, hands in his pockets, his expression calm. The air was cold against his skin, but his presence was unwavering. Across the street, Melanie stood stiffly, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes, filled with accusation, burned into him as though she were daring him to lie, daring him to resist. Keanu looked at her for a brief moment, then back at the officers. His voice was steady, low, and utterly unaffected. What's going on? A wrong assumption. One of the officers narrowed his eyes. We got a call about suspicious activity at your house, he said. Reports of someone near your security cameras. Your internet being the only one working during an outage. Keanu's brows lifted slightly at that, tilting his head as if he had just heard something mildly interesting. His lips pressed together, considering. Then finally he spoke. You're welcome to take a look. The officers hesitated. They had expected defensiveness, panic, maybe even hostility, but instead they were met with quiet acceptance. Something about that threw them off. Still, protocol was protocol. One of them gestured toward the door. We'll need to check inside. Keanu didn't argue. Without a word, he turned and stepped aside, holding the door open for them. Inside Keanu's home, the officers moved in carefully, sweeping the space with quick, trained eyes. What they found? Nothing. The house was simple, clean. A large bookshelf lined one wall, filled with well-worn novels, some stacked haphazardly, as if he had pulled a few down just hours ago. A few guitars rested against the corner, untouched. A modest couch sat in the center of the living room, unassuming. No extravagant furniture, no security screens showing suspicious camera feeds, no locked doors hiding secrets. Hardly the home of a man running some underground operation. Still, the officers did their job. They checked every room, examined the security system, ran diagnostics on his Wi-Fi network. Then something changed. One of the officers stationed near Keanu's laptop frowned as he watched unfamiliar code scrolling rapidly across the screen. Something was wrong. The officer's fingers flew over the keyboard, his eyes narrowing. Wait a second. Another officer stepped closer. What is it? The first officer pointed at the screen. Keanu's security cameras weren't just his own. They were linked to a private server. Someone had infiltrated them, and not just to watch him. They were using his connection as a gateway, a bridge to something much bigger. Keanu had been hacked, and whoever had done it hadn't just stopped at him. The officer's heart pounded as he traced the digital fingerprints. And then it hit him. His stomach sank. This wasn't just a case of one man's Wi-Fi acting strange. This was a full-scale cyber attack. And the target wasn't just Keanu Reeves, it was Hollywood. Outside, the weight of the truth begins to sink in. Melanie's foot tapped impatiently against the pavement. She watched the officers move through Keanu's house, waiting for them to drag out whatever he was hiding, waiting for her suspicions to be confirmed. She had imagined this moment, the truth being exposed, the mystery of Keanu Reeves finally revealed. Then, the front door opened, and everything changed. The officers emerged, but their focus had shifted. They weren't looking at Keanu like a suspect anymore. They were looking at her. Melanie frowned. Her arms loosened slightly. A creeping unease twisted in her stomach. One of the officers stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Melanie?" he asked slowly. "Do you have a nephew named Brandon?" Her breath caught. The name hit her like a hammer to the chest. What? She stammered. The officer hesitated, then held up a laptop. The screen glowed in the night, casting a blue tint on his hands. Lines of code scrolled endlessly, but it was the open message thread that made her stomach drop. A chat log. "Brandon, dude, this is insane. We actually got in. Not just Keanu's house, them. All of them. Unknown user. Keep going. You're part of something big now." Melanie's throat went dry. The officer's voice was grave. "Your nephew is behind this," he said. "He hacked into Keanu's system and in the process accessed a major network of private information. Celebrities, high-profile individuals." Melanie's body stiffened. She shook her head, barely able to speak. That's not possible." But it was. Just a few feet away, inside the police car, Brandon sat hunched over, his hands trembling. His face was pale, his breath uneven. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he murmured. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It was just a game at first, a challenge. I thought I was just proving I could do it. I didn't know I was working with them." The officer sitting next to him frowned. "Who's them?" he asked. Brandon swallowed hard. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The chat log said enough. This wasn't just a kid messing around. This was organized cybercrime, and Brandon had just unknowingly sold his skills to a group far beyond his understanding. And just like that, Melanie's suspicions, the ones that had led her to call the cops on Keanu Reeves, had turned back on her own family. She had accused the wrong man, and now she had to live with that. A heavy night, a hard truth. The night air was thick, heavy with an invisible weight that no one could quite put into words. Keanu stood on his porch, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful. His face, unreadable as ever, was bathed in the glow of flashing red and blue lights. The police cars remained stationed along the quiet suburban street, their radios crackling faintly in the distance. Nearby officers spoke in hushed voices, exchanging notes, filing reports, making quiet calls to cybercrime divisions that were now scrambling to piece together what had happened. And in the middle of it all, Melanie stood frozen, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her mind was in chaos. Just an hour ago, she had felt certain that she was right to call the police, certain that Keanu was hiding something, certain that she had uncovered a dangerous secret. Now the truth had crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Her nephew Brandon was in the back of a police car, staring blankly at the dashboard, his hands shaking in his lap. This wasn't just some teenager messing around on the internet. This wasn't some harmless prank. Brandon had been part of something big, something dangerous. The police were still trying to grasp the full scope of it, but one thing was already clear. He hadn't just hacked into Keanu Reeves' Wi-Fi. He had unknowingly opened the doors to a full-scale cybercrime operation. The quiet street, the normal houses, the simple suburban life, none of it seemed real anymore. One of the officers stepped forward, clearing his throat before speaking. "Mr. Reeves, we owe you an apology," he said, his voice more formal, more respectful now. Keanu, standing barefoot on his porch, tilted his head slightly. He didn't say anything, didn't smirk, didn't demand an explanation. He just listened. The officer continued, choosing his words carefully. "It looks like your system was compromised. This wasn't just about your house. You were the entry point to something much bigger." Keanu gave a small nod, absorbing the information. He wasn't surprised, not really. The officer shifted uncomfortably before adding, "Your internet wasn't the only one working because it was untouched. It was the target. Someone was using your connection to breach private databases belonging to multiple celebrities, bank accounts, emails, confidential information." A beat of silence, then a pause before the final blow. "And the person responsible?" The officer hesitated for just a second before his gaze flickered toward Melanie. "Your neighbor's nephew." the weight of reality. Melanie flinched as if she had been physically struck. She had been gripping her arms so tightly that her fingernails dug into her skin. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Keanu remained still, his gaze moving between Melanie and the officer. There was no anger in his face, no smug satisfaction at being proven innocent, just quiet understanding. Melanie felt her knees go weak. This couldn't be real. Her nephew, her Brandon, the boy she had helped raise, the kid she had scolded for spending too much time on the computer, the teenager who had always been so bright, so curious, had been working with cyber criminals, had been stealing private information from Hollywood's most elite. She shook her head slowly. That's not possible. But it was. One of the officers, still studying the laptop retrieved from Brandon's backpack, let out a long exhale. We're still piecing it together, but your network was being used as a bridge, Mr. Reeves. Brandon wasn't working alone. He had access to a much larger cybercrime operation. We found logs of attempted breaches on major Hollywood figures. Another officer added, his voice grim. This wasn't just about money. These hackers don't just steal. They ruin people. They leak personal conversations, fabricate stories, destroy reputations, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process. Melanie's breathing became unsteady. Her Brandon had been involved in that. Her legs felt weak as she turned her gaze toward the police car. Inside, Brandon sat slumped in the back seat, staring blankly at his hands. His expression wasn't one of rebellion. It wasn't even fear. It was shock. He looked broken, like he hadn't realized until this very moment just how far he had fallen. He murmured something to the officer sitting next to him. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. The officer watching him narrowed his eyes. What did you think was going to happen? Brandon swallowed hard. It was just a game at first, a challenge. I thought I was just proving I could do it. I didn't know I was working with them. The officer's expression darkened. Who's them? Brandon didn't answer. He didn't have to. The chat log said enough. This wasn't just a kid messing around online. This was organized cybercrime, and Brandon had walked right into it without even realizing what he had become a part of. And just like that, Melanie's world, the one where she had spent the whole night convinced that Keanu Reeves was the problem, came crashing down. She had accused the wrong man, and now she had to live with that, a moment of truth. Slowly, hesitantly, Melanie turned back to Keanu. Her face was pale, her throat dry. The words felt heavy, like they might shatter into pieces if she spoke too fast. I'm so sorry. Keanu didn't react at first. He just studied her. His eyes, calm and thoughtful, held no malice, no resentment, no I told you so. Then after a long pause, he finally spoke. Don't apologize. Melanie blinked. Keanu's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained steady, unshaken. Just be better. The words hung in the air, simple, heavy, a statement, not an accusation, a lesson, not a punishment. Even the officers seemed to pause at the weight of them. Melanie felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't throwing it in her face. He was just Keanu, the aftermath. Brandon was taken into custody that night. The investigation would take weeks, maybe months. His involvement was deeper than anyone had realized. But Keanu, he didn't give the media anything. The next day, when reporters swarmed his neighborhood, desperate for a statement, for a reaction, he simply smiled, waved, and walked away. No drama, no bitterness, no revenge. Later that evening, as he sat with a close friend over a quiet cup of coffee, he finally spoke about it. Privacy doesn't exist anymore, he said thoughtfully. Not just for people like me, for everyone. Someone, somewhere, is always watching. His friend sighed. That's a scary thought. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Yeah, he admitted. But you know what's scarier? His friend raised an eyebrow. Keanu took a sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with a quiet clink. The fact that people don't even realize it yet. And with that, the conversation shifted. No dramatics, no self-pity, because Keanu Reeves didn't need to prove a point. He had already made it. The night ends, but the wait remains. The once bustling street was now eerily quiet. The flashing red and blue lights, which had bathed the neighborhood in chaos, were fading into the distance, disappearing one by one as the last of the police cars rolled away. The low hum of their engines grew softer until finally there was nothing but silence. Keanu stood on his porch, hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his jacket, his expression unreadable as he watched the final patrol car turn the corner and vanish from sight. But the air felt different now, thicker, heavier, as if the entire night had left an invisible weight pressing down on everything. The neighborhood, once buzzing with whispered conversations and tense accusations, had fallen into an uneasy stillness. It was over, but it didn't feel like it. Across the street, Melanie hadn't moved. She stood frozen on her front steps, arms still wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the empty street like she expected the night to rewind itself. Just hours ago, she had been so sure. She had felt like the hero of the story, the one who had uncovered the truth, who had exposed something dark and dangerous lurking right in her own backyard. But the truth had turned everything upside down. Her nephew, her own family, had been the real threat. And Keanu? He had been the victim all along. She forced herself to look at him again, but the words wouldn't come. What could she even say? I'm sorry. It felt hollow. I didn't know. That didn't matter. I was wrong. It didn't change anything. Yet Keanu had already given her his answer. Don't apologize. Just be better. That sentence echoed in her mind, looping over and over as she turned, walking into her house in a daze. She closed the door behind her and let out a shaky breath. The truth wasn't just painful. It was humiliating. And no matter how many times she replayed the night in her head, she couldn't take any of it back. The next day, the media circus begins. By morning, the world knew. News spread fast, faster than any of them could have anticipated. But instead of focusing on the real story, a massive cybercrime operation, a Hollywood-wide hacking attempt, the shocking revelation of a young hacker unknowingly working with criminals, the media had other ideas. They didn't want the truth, they wanted the drama. Keanu Reeves accused by neighbor, but the truth is shocking. Keanu caught in cybercrime scandal, and what he said will surprise you. Keanu's privacy invaded, but his reaction leaves everyone speechless. Reporters swarmed outside his neighborhood. Camera crews stood along the sidewalks, microphones in hand, waiting, hoping that Keanu would step outside and give them the perfect soundbite. They wanted outrage. They wanted a headline. They wanted a reaction. But Keanu being Keanu, he gave them nothing. No anger, no demand for justice, no self-pity. That morning, he simply walked outside, ignored the cameras, put on his helmet, and got on his motorcycle, just like he did every other day. No interviews, no spectacle, just silence. And somehow that spoke louder than any headline ever could. A conversation that says it all. Later that evening, Keanu met up with a close friend at a quiet cafe, one of the few places where no one would bother him. The atmosphere was warm, the soft glow of hanging lights reflecting off the wooden tables. People around him were engaged in their own conversations, oblivious to the fact that one of the most famous men in the world was sitting among them, just being human. He ordered his usual black coffee, wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic cup, and took a slow sip. For a long time, he didn't speak. His friend didn't push. And then finally, in that calm, thoughtful voice of his, Keanu said, "Privacy is gone." His friend frowned, setting down his own drink. "What do you mean?" Keanu exhaled softly, staring down at the dark liquid in his cup. People think they have control over their lives, but they don't. Someone, somewhere is always watching, always listening. His friend's frown deepened. "You mean like hackers?" Keanu gave a slow nod, but then shook his head slightly. "Not just them, everyone. Governments, corporations, the media, strangers on the internet. We've given up privacy for convenience, and most people don't even realize it." The friend leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settling over them. "So, what do we do?" Keanu let out a small breath, as if he had been asking himself the same question for years. Then he gave a small, knowing smile. "We learn to live differently." His friend raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip of coffee, let the silence linger, let the moment breathe. Then he said, "We stop pretending we're invisible." And that was that. No grand speech, no paranoia, just a quiet truth that only someone like Keanu Reeves could say, in a way that made you really think. The lasting lesson. The story wasn't just about a misunderstanding between neighbors. It wasn't just about cybercrime or hackers or even Keanu himself. It was about something bigger. It was about privacy, about assumptions, about how easily people are willing to believe the worst in someone they barely know. Melanie had spent months watching Keanu, building a story in her mind, convinced she had uncovered something dark. But the truth? She had never actually known him, because if she had, she would have realized the truth sooner. That Keanu Reeves wasn't the man with secrets. He was the man who had already learned to live without them. The world is changing. Privacy isn't what it used to be. And sometimes the truth is far more complicated than it seems. Keanu Reeves didn't need to prove himself. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't even demand an apology. Instead, he left us with a simple but powerful lesson. Don't apologize. Just be better. If you found this story as eye-opening as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. You won't want to miss what's coming next.